December 29th, 1980, around 9 p.m., it's East Texas. We're on a 2-lane road called FM 1485. It cuts through the Piney Woods. That's dense forest on both sides of the road. No streetlights, no houses for miles. It's the kind of road where you can drive for 20 minutes and not see another car. Now there's 3 people in a 1980 Oldsmobile Cutlass. 51-year-old woman's behind the wheel, her friend, 57, in the passenger seat, and a 7-year-old boy's in the back. They're driving home from Dayton after a night out, dinner at a truck stop. They tried to play bingo, but the holes were closed for the holidays. It's a do-nothing evening. It's the kind of night you forget by morning, but the boy sees it first. It's through the trees, there's a light. It's bright, piercing in fact. Sees it through the branches every few seconds as they drive. Looks like it's rising and dropping, and it's getting closer. Now the 2 women, they ignore it. But eventually, ignoring it, that kind of goes out the window because it's not in the distance anymore. It's directly in front of them. It's hovering directly over the road. And the air inside the car, it's getting hot. The driver slams on the brakes. The passenger lurches forward and puts her hand on the dashboard to catch herself. And when she pulls it away, there's an imprint. The vinyl is soft, like it's been sitting in an oven. Now all 3 get out. Above them, maybe 60 feet, 80 feet above, is a massive object. It's diamond-shaped with flattened points at the top and the bottom. Looks like a dull metallic silver with blue lights around the center. And from underneath, flames are shooting downward like a blowtorch aimed at the road. The thing is roughly the size of a water tower. Now the heat is unbelievable. The grandmother thinks the world's ending. She's praying. She tells the boy, if you see a big man coming from that thing, that'll be Jesus. Meanwhile, the boy is screaming. He pulls his grandmother back to the car, but the driver doesn't go back. She walks towards it. She stands at the front of the car. She's staring up at this thing. She's feeling the heat cook her from the inside out for several minutes. When she finally tries to get back into the car, the door handle is so hot she can't touch it with her bare hands. She has to wrap a leather jacket around it like a pot holder to open the door, and the car won't start. They're trapped. The windows are up. The heat is pouring through the glass, and for the next 20 minutes, they just sit there. They eventually hear something. Rotors, helicopters, big ones. Double rotors, so military. They're coming from every direction. The boy starts counting, 23 in total. The object tilts to one side, it rises above the treetops and moves south. The helicopters fall into formation behind it, and the whole procession disappears over the horizon. The car starts up again, the radio comes back on, the temperature drops. Nobody says a word. The driver puts it in gear and takes Grandma back home, and by the time they get there, all 3 are already sick. Headaches, nausea, the boy's face is red. Now within days, the driver will be unrecognizable. Her skin will blister. Her hair will fall out in clumps. Her eyes will swell shut. She'll be hospitalized for weeks and eventually develop breast cancer. She'll spend the next 18 years begging the United States government to tell her what burned her on that road. Spoiler alert, they won't. She'll sue them for $20 million. They'll use a legal technicality to shut her down. She dies on December 29th, 1998, the 18th anniversary, and to this day, nobody was ever held accountable. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. This is the Cash-Landrum incident. Stay with me. So who are these people? Well, the driver's name is Betty Cash. She's 51, born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. Betty's no stranger to hard work. She's run a grocery store. She's worked as a waitress, worked for years as a private nurse. By 1980, she's living in Dayton, Texas. It's a small town 30 miles northeast of Houston. In the passenger seat that night is her friend Vickie Landrum. Vickie's 57, a deeply religious woman, born-again Christian, the kind of person who sees a ball of light in the sky and her first thought is revelation. And in the back seat is Vickie's grandson, 7-year-old Colby Landrum. Now here's an important detail about these 3. None of them have any interest in UFOs. None of them have ever reported seeing anything strange in the sky. Betty Cash later said that before 1980, when she heard somebody talk about UFOs, she'd laugh about it. So this is not a group of people looking for something weird to happen. This is a grandmother, her friend, and a little boy driving home from dinner on a Monday night during Christmas week. That's it. December 29th, 1980, they head out that evening looking for a bingo game. Remember, the halls were closed due to the holidays. Instead, they grab dinner at a truck stop restaurant near New Caney. Around 9 p.m., they get back in Betty's 1980 Cutlass, and they head south on RM 1485 towards Dayton. FM 1485 runs through the East Piney Woods, 2 lanes, no shoulders, thick forests on both sides, so it's dark and isolated. You get the picture. Now, we already know what happened on the road because we covered it in the very beginning. What we didn't cover is what happens when they got home. Betty drops Vickie and Colby off at their place in Dayton, and by the time she gets to her own house, she's falling apart. Headache so bad she can barely see, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Her skin feels like it's on fire, and all she wants is water. Now, back at Vickie's house, the same thing. Vickie's sick, Colby's sick, the boy's face is sunburned red and his eyes are irritated. But Betty's the worst. And it's not even close. She'd been outside the car the longest. She was standing in front of the Cutlass. She was staring up at that object for several minutes while Vickie and Colby were back inside. Now, she got the full dose, whatever that dose was. Over the next few days, it gets worse. A deep redness spreads across Betty's face like the worst sunburn you've ever seen. Blisters start breaking out on her face, her eyelids, large ones I'm talking. Her eyes swell shut. Clumps of her hair start falling out. And even stranger, they don't tell anyone what happened. Well, not right away at first. Understandably, they're scared that nobody's going to believe them. So for weeks, Betty Cash is deteriorating in silence. She's eventually admitted to Parkway Hospital, and she's in bad shape. So much swelling on her face and her eyelids that her appearance is altered. And when a friend comes to visit her in the hospital, she doesn't even recognize Betty. That's how bad it is. Vickie and Colby aren't doing great either. Vickie's having headaches, nausea, skin problems, and her vision's starting to go. She'll eventually develop a cataract in one eye. Colby's got facial burns, eye irritation, and also now emotional damage is kicking in. Remember, he's 7 years old, and now he's terrified of helicopters. He's terrified of the sky. But Betty's condition is the one that forces the secret out because she's so sick, doctors are asking questions that she can't dodge anymore. So she tells them. All three of them tell the hospital staff what happened that night on FM 1485. And here's what the doctors don't do. They don't laugh. They actually take it seriously, and they order a full workup. A dermatologist examines Betty and confirms that this looks like a form of radiation damage. Radiation, not a sunburn or an allergic reaction. Something irradiated these people on that road. So we've got a dermatologist saying this looks like radiation damage. Let's talk about what that actually looks like, because Betty Cash's medical file, it reads like something out of Hiroshima. And that's not my comparison, by the way. That's the doctor's. Dr. Brian McKellen, a physician in Birmingham, Alabama, he eventually becomes Betty's primary doctor. He calls her a textbook example of radiation poisoning. He compares her severity to being 3 to 5 miles from the epicenter of a nuclear test. A 1981 biopsy of Betty's skin finds radiation dermatitis, the redness and blistering we talked about, swollen earlobes, severe hair loss, not thinning, clumps falling out of her scalp, fingernail shedding, loss of appetite, weight loss, depressed immune system, exhaustion so bad that she can barely get out of bed. She's in and out of the hospital from January 81 through the rest of that year. And it doesn't stop. 1983, Betty's diagnosed with breast cancer. She has a mastectomy, her right breast is removed. New tumors keep reappearing even after that. Her doctor, the surgeon who did the procedure, Dr. Frank Wilson, is warned that treating Betty with radiation could be a critical mistake given what she'd already been exposed to. So, a cancer patient who can't receive standard radiation treatment because she's already been irradiated by something nobody can identify. Now, Vickie's not as severe, but she's not okay. Headaches, nausea, the skin problems persist. Her eyesight deteriorates. She develops a cataract and eventually can't read numbers or work with small print. She applies for disability, and Social Security sends her to the Northwest Mental Health Clinic in Houston. They ask her if she hears voices, what she does for recreation, how much dope she's on. Those are their words. A neighbor named Martha Thompson watches 7-year-old Colby grow up. She sees him playing in the yard, and sometimes he'll just stop and start rubbing his eyes, scratching his arms. She asks him what's wrong, and he says, "My skin's hot. It's still hot." This is where it gets complicated, because the radiation question isn't as clean as it sounds. A radiologist named Dr. Peter Rank analyzes Betty's medical file. His conclusion is that radiation damage did occur, but the type is unknown. It's probably limited in severity and no evidence of systemic involvement. That last part is important because systemic involvement from ionizing radiation at that distance would have been fatal. All three of them should have been dead. A researcher named Brad Sparks studied the radiation shielding factors. It's something nobody else apparently thought to do. His argument is pretty straightforward. If it was ionizing radiation, gamma rays, neutrons traveling 140 feet through open air from that object into the car, it wouldn't just go through the windshield. It would scatter. It would go around the corners. The car's engine block and the metal body provide almost no shielding. Vickie and Colby, sitting inside the Cutlass, would have gotten roughly the same amount of dosage as Betty, who was standing outside. And that dose, at that range, with the symptoms appearing within 30 minutes, that should be 100% fatal. They'd all be dead within days. But they didn't die. So it probably wasn't ionizing radiation. If that's the case, what was it? Spark suggests something called radiomimetic effect, chemicals that mimic the symptoms of radiation sickness without actually being irradiated. Nitrogen mustards in chemical warfare do exactly this. Dr. Rank lists other possibilities: infrared, ultraviolet, microwave radiation. None of those cause the classic radiation sickness either, but they can cause burns and skin damage, so we're in a strange place. Something clearly hurt these people. The medical evidence is real, but the type of exposure doesn't really fit into any single category. And nobody from the government is offering to run any kind of tests that could actually answer the question. When Schuessler checks Betty's car and the encounter site with a Geiger counter in 1981, he finds no elevated radioactive level. Betty's blood tests come back negative for ionizing radiation, but the burns are real, the blisters are real, the hair loss is real, the cancer is very real, and Betty Cash is about to spend the rest of her life trying to get somebody to explain exactly what did this to her. Betty and Vickie start making phone calls to everybody you can imagine. And I mean everybody. They contact Senators Lloyd Benston and John Tower out of Texas. They contact NASA. They contact every government agency that you can think that might have some answer to what burned them on that road. Benston and Tower, to their credit, actually respond. They suggest Betty and Vickie file a complaint with the Judge Advocate Claims Office in Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin. NASA gives them something different, a name, John Schuessler. Schuessler's an interesting guy. I mentioned him earlier. He's a longtime aerospace engineer who's worked with one of NASA's principal contractors since 1962. In early 1981, he's the flight operations manager for the space shuttle program at Johnson Space Center, helping get Columbia ready for its maiden voyage. He's also the deputy director of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, which is the largest civilian UFO investigation operation in the country. In 1976, he founded something called VISIT, the Vehicle Internal Systems Investigative Team. It's a group of aerospace engineers trying to figure out if there's a way to integrate what people report seeing in UFO sightings into actual propulsion science. So this isn't some guy in a tinfoil hat. This is a NASA program manager with 200 engineers under him who happens to take UFO reports seriously on the side. Betty Cash calls Schuessler's office at Johnson Space Center in February of 1981. She leaves a message. He ignores it. A week earlier, he'd gotten a call from two women in California who were, in his words, obviously deluded. So the last thing he needs is more waste of time. But then a doctor friend calls him and says, "John, there's a strange case at Parkway Hospital. A woman who's been burned by something, and she's saying it was a UFO. The doctor says, this is serious. The woman has been really hurt." That gets Schuessler's attention. He calls Betty back. He drives to Houston to meet her. And on February 21st, 1981, he sees her for the first time. He takes notes and photographs. He's looking at a woman covered in burns and blisters and patches of hair missing from her scalp. Whatever Schuessler expected, this is worse. He agrees to investigate, and this becomes the most frustrating project of his career. First thing he does, he takes Betty and Vickie back to the site on FM 1485, and they find something. A large circular burn mark on the road where the object was hovering. It's permanently scorched. Now, Schuessler documents it, he photographs it. He comes back in a few weeks to do more testing, and the road's been dug up, repaved. Witnesses in the area say that unmarked trucks came and they went and hauled the tarmac away. Curious. Schuessler starts canvassing the area for other witnesses because Betty and Vickie can't be the only people who saw 23 helicopters flying over East Texas on Monday night, and they're not. An off-duty Dayton police officer named L.L. Walker and his wife Marie were driving home that very same night. Now, Walker's a veteran patrolman. He's coming back from Cleveland, Texas, past midnight, roughly 3 hours after Betty and Vickie's encounter. He and Marie see helicopters, a lot of them. Walker says there were some big work helicopters with double rotors in the front and the back, 4 or 5 of them, and then a little command helicopter painted with army inscriptions, identifications, stars, the whole thing. He tells his wife, "That's very unusual." A bakery clerk named Belle McGee reports seeing a bright light in the sky that very same night near Dayton. Says whatever it was, it lit up like a football field. Another woman named Angie Stanley, a postal worker, says she noticed something that looked like car lights lights coming in over the trees. And then there's Jerry McDonald. McDonald's a police officer out of Lake Jackson. He's off duty on the night in question. He describes seeing a diamond-shaped object about half the size of a football field, the color of galvanized steel. Now, the only difference between his sighting and Betty's is that in his sighting, he sees red lights instead of blue. McDonald says that everybody thinks he's crazy for reporting it. He says he knew it wasn't an airplane because he's been working in the U.S. Army Reserves and knows just about every fixed-wing aircraft there is. So we've got 3 witnesses in a car, plus a cop and his wife who saw the helicopters, plus at least 3 other independent witnesses who saw unusual activity in the sky the very same night. That's not nothing, but here's what nobody saw. Any branch of the United States military admitting they had helicopters in the air that night. Which brings us to Bergstrom. August 17th, 1981, Betty and Vickie finally get their meeting with personnel at Bergstrom Air Force Base. They're expecting help, medical guidance, maybe an explanation. What they get is interrogation. When they walk into that room, there's already a large map of the area on the wall, and the exact location of the encounter is marked with a pin. Somebody already knows where it happened. And for the next 2 hours, Betty and Vickie are grilled about what they saw, and not sympathetically, aggressively. The interviewers dismiss the idea that the military was involved at all. No medical help is offered, no explanation is given. Betty and Vickie leave with nothing. The Air Force does eventually pass it along. In early 1982, it lands on the desk of the Department of the Army Inspector General. They appoint Lieutenant Colonel George Saran to investigate whether U.S. military helicopters were involved in this incident. Saran's a serious guy. He later becomes comptroller for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He spends 3 months on the phone trying to establish what installation within a reasonable proximity of Houston could have mobilized helicopters for a mission of that size. He draws a blank. Every base he calls says no. He interviews L.L. Walker, he interviews the witnesses, he even meets with a contact at the CIA. He asks the CIA guy, "Is there any chance somebody was intentionally misleading me?" The CIA contact says unequivocally, no. In June 1982, Saran submits his report. The concluding sentence leaves no room for ambiguity. Says, "There's no evidence that would indicate that Army, National Guard, or Army Reserve helicopters were involved." But here's what's interesting about Saran. He finds the witnesses credible, says his overriding concern was whether Army helicopters were involved in the incident, and it seemed to him that something happened to cause the women to be burned. But whether or not they were burned was not part of his charter. His job was the helicopters, and the helicopters were a dead end. He also speculates that the Air Force may have steered the witnesses towards identifying the helicopters as Chinooks, because the Air Force doesn't own Chinooks. The Army does. So by pointing Betty and Vickie at the Army, the Air Force neatly sidesteps the whole thing. Every door they knock on closes, but there's one left, and Betty Cash is not the kind of woman that gives up. December 27th, 1982, almost exactly 2 years after the encounter. Now, attorney Peter Gersten files the first formal claims for compensation at Bergstrom Air Force Base on behalf of Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and Colby Landrum. He's filed Freedom of Information lawsuits against NASA, the NSA, and other agencies. He's not a crank. He knows how the federal system works. The claim is denied on May 20th, 1983. Gersten files an appeal on July 23rd. Gets denied again on August 21st. So in January of 1984, Gersten takes another step. He files a civil lawsuit in the U.S. District Court, Southern District of Texas, Cash-Landrum v. the United States of America. They're seeking $20 million in damages. It'll be the first time the United States government has ever been sued for damages caused by a UFO. His words. Now, the government's defense is interesting because they don't actually deny the encounter. They don't say nothing happened to those people. What they say is, you can't prove which part of the government did it. The Army says it wasn't them. The Air Force says it wasn't them. NASA says it wasn't them. So they each submit sworn affidavits, high-ranking officials stating under oath that their branch does not own or operate any aircraft matching the description of a diamond-shaped object with flame shooting out and radiation. Now, under the Federal Tort Claims Act, you can sue the government if the government employee or an agency injures you through negligence, but you have to name the specific agency responsible. You can't just say the government in general. Betty and Vickie knew something military was up there. They saw the helicopters. Colby counted 23 of them. L.L. Walker saw them too, along with Army markings. But if the Army says it wasn't their helicopters, and the Air Force says it wasn't their craft, and NASA says it wasn't their project, Who do you point the finger at? That's the catch-22. The government's position is essentially, sure, something may have happened to you, but since you can't tell us exactly who hurt you, we're not liable. It's a procedural wall, and it's almost impossible to climb. But Gersten tries. He requests discovery. He wants the rosters of all personnel authorized and trained to fly CH-47s. He wants the flight logs. He wants the locations of every Chinook in the territory. The government pushes back at every step. Gersten even requests that they identify something called Project Snowbird and Project Moondust. We'll circle back to where those names came from because that part of the story is its own disaster. Meanwhile, the case drags on for years. Betty's health is getting much worse. She's in and out of hospitals. She's running up medical bills she can't pay. A reporter catches up with her at a Birmingham airport in the mid-80s. She's sitting in the terminal talking about the mastectomy, about the chemo, about how every time she goes to the hospital for treatment, she breaks out in blisters from the sun coming in through the car window. She says, "I think my immunity's messed up." She talks about writing a letter to the president after he was shot, sending her condolences, asking if he can give her any kind of relief, anything that would be helpful. She says, "Every time I go to the doctor, I'm scared to death to find out what I'm going to find out next." On August 21st, 1966, Judge Ross Sterling dismisses the case, never goes to trial. The government's lawyers argued that the complaint was so vague that the plaintiffs had insufficient information to identify the aircraft as theirs. In a later statement, the government adds, "The plaintiff's actions and inactions were also contributory negligent, and by reason of such contributory negligence, the injuries alleged were sustained." Translation, the government is saying it's partly your fault that you got hurt. Betty Cash stood outside and stared at that thing. That's their argument. A woman is irradiated on a public highway by something that the government won't identify, and that their legal position is that she should have known better than to look at it. Betty's reaction? She says she'll do whatever it takes to bring attention to the case. "I'll fight until they lay me in my grave." And she wasn't exaggerating. But what Betty doesn't know, what nobody involved in the case knows yet, is that the investigation was poisoned from the very beginning. And not by the government, by the people who claim to be helping. Remember those names Peter Gersten put on the interrogatories? Project Snowbird, Project Moondust. Want to know where he got them? From a con man. Actually, from two con men. And the story of how they poisoned the Cash-Landrum investigation is one of the most infuriating I've come across on this channel. Let's start with the names. Richard C. Doty, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And William L. Moore, UFO researcher, co-author of a 1980 book called The Roswell Incident. Now, these two are working together by the late 1980s. Now, Doty's claim is that this was part of a special program that was tasked with collecting intelligence and counterintelligence on UFOs. His job, according to him, was to gather information from civilian UFO researchers while feeding them a mix of real data and fabrication. Moore was his primary asset. And Moore's strategy was pretty simple: fake it till you make it. He used his connection to Doty to portray himself as a guy with deep government information, insiders who knew what was really going on with UFOs. He gave these contacts bird code names. He called the whole network the Aviary. Doty's code name was Falcon. So the Cash-Landrum case breaks in February of 1981. Moore knows about it from day one, literally day one. On February 2nd, 1981, the same day Vickie Landrum calls the National UFO Reporting Center for help, Moore gets a phone call tipping him off to the case. That same night, he calls a medical doctor in Houston and asks him to look into it. He's on it immediately. But Moore doesn't investigate the case himself. He lets MUFON's John Schuessler handle the field work. Moore's playing a longer game. By the end of 1981, Doty feeds Moore a detailed story about the Cash-Landrum UFO. In December of 81, Moore meets with Doty at a restaurant in Albuquerque, and Doty lays the whole thing out. According to Doty, the object Betty and Vickie saw was an experimental craft developed jointly by the Air Force and NASA. It was housed at Ellington Air Force Base near Houston. It had been fitted with experimental nuclear propulsion systems with a conventional engine as a backup. On the night of December 29, 1980, the craft was being test flown from Ellington to Fort Hood with 2 pilots aboard. The navigational systems failed, the craft strayed from its flight plan, and the nuclear engine malfunctioned. Helicopters were scrambled from Fort Hood to guide it in. The pilots nearly ditched into Lake Houston before the backup engines fired and the escort helicopters arrived. According to Doty, there were 9 civilians who witnessed the incident. 6 were debriefed by Air Force intelligence, including 2 Texas Highway Patrol officers, and all 6 were made to sign security disclosures. Betty, Vickie, and Colby were not contacted because they'd already been involved with UFO researchers. Doty said the government decided that those three could be used to further the UFO explanation, which could provide an effective cover for what really happened. So why the secrecy? Doty's answer? The government wanted to avoid public outcry against nuclear propulsion research. It's similar to what was already happening with the nuclear power industry. They didn't want the public to know that they were testing nuclear-powered devices anywhere near Houston. It's a great story, it's detailed, plausible, it's full of real locations and real military installations. There's just one problem. None of it is true, and Doty knows it. This is disinformation. It's manufactured, it's distributed with a purpose. Moore takes this story and starts spreading it. He tells it to APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, the oldest UFO group in the country. APRO publishes a version of it in their bulletin in August of 1982. They say the object was a U.S. experimental aircraft that had gotten out of control. Moore tells John Schuessler the same story at a MUFON symposium in Toronto that same summer, and Schuessler pushes back. He writes to APRO saying that he was quite upset that they'd published the claim. He says Moore convinced him during their discussion in Toronto that the experimental aircraft story was interesting, but only a story. Schuessler tries to find a correlation between Doty's version and the actual event, and he can't. But the damage is already spreading, because Moore also tells the story to Peter Gersten, the attorney representing Betty and Vickie, and Gersten believes it. This is the guy filing the lawsuit, and he's taking intelligence from a known disinformation agent. Gersten puts Identify Project Snowbird in his official court interrogatories. He's chasing a phantom. It's a fictional program invented by Rick Doty, and he's building part of his legal strategy around it. He's basically asking the government to admit to a project that doesn't exist, which the government is more than happy to deny under oath. When confronted by Gersten, Moore claims to have physical evidence, soil samples, photographs, an executive briefing document. Gersten writes him a furious letter in April of 1983 demanding he produce it. Says he can't understand how Moore can withhold evidence material to the case while the witness's health deteriorates. He signs it, "See you in court." Moore's reply? He says he's turned everything over to a third party for independent evaluation. When that's done, he'll turn over the results. Gersten writes again in June, "Where's that independent evaluation you promised?" Nothing. MUFON director Walt Andrews and John Schuessler confront Moore in person at the 1983 MUFON Symposium in Pasadena. Andrews later writes, "Bill Moore couldn't or wouldn't provide any help with this lead when we cornered him in Pasadena." Schuessler's notes from that meeting are pretty devastating. He asks Moore point blank, "Do you really know what that object was?" Moore said he had an informant who started giving him information on several cases. He shared some of it with Peter Gersten and later exposed it on national TV. The informant got in trouble and won't cooperate further. So according to Moore, any information he could have gotten is no longer possible. It's classic bait and switch. He can't produce evidence because his source dried up. He can't name names because it would endanger people. He always has a reason why the proof is just out of reach. Betty and Vickie are getting false hopes from the story again and again since 1981 onward. And it gets worse. October 14th, 1988, a live television special called UFO Cover-Up Live is broadcast from Washington, D.C. Now, Betty Cash and Cash-Landrum appear on the show to tell their story. While they're sitting there, a pre-taped segment plays of a man in silhouette, his voice disguised electronically using a code name Falcon. That's Richard Doty. And here's what he tells a national television audience about the Cash-Landrum case. He says the craft Betty and Vickie saw was an alien craft piloted by military aircraft pilots, not a secret experimental plane anymore. Now it's an alien spacecraft with American pilots, so the story's evolved. He says the pilots were trained on the craft, but it didn't seem to respond to control. They radioed in that it was going to crash. The helicopters were standard search and rescue protocol. Betty Cash nods along as Doty talks about helicopters like she's hearing confirmation of what she's been saying for 8 years. She doesn't know she's being used as a prop. She doesn't know that the man in the shadows is the same person who manufactured the story that helped destroy her lawsuit. And here's the timeline on Doty's version of the case, because it shifts every time he tells it. In 1981, it's a U.S. Air Force NASA experimental craft with nuclear propulsion from Ellington to Fort Hood. In 1983, he tells Peter Gersten it's a government craft previously mentioned in Aviation Week magazine. In 1988, it's an alien craft piloted by U.S. military pilots. 2005, he tells a radio host it was an atomic-powered anti-gravity craft on a test mission to fly over the Gulf of Mexico. 2014, he tells researcher Kurt Collins It involved a reverse-engineered craft with nuclear power systems, and he claims the details are still classified. In 2017, he says on camera he met with the 4 Air Force pilots involved and that it was a reverse-engineered extraterrestrial craft, and he knows that for a fact. In 2019, he says the craft never descended lower than 1,000 feet and that the witnesses may have been exaggerating their injuries. He also claims in that interview that there was a secret settlement with the government, and Betty was quietly paid to cover her medical expenses. So in one version, the witnesses are gravely irradiated, and in another version, they're exaggerating. In one version, the United States government made a plane. In another, it's an alien spacecraft. In one version, Betty spent 18 years fighting for recognition. In another, she was secretly compensated. None of these versions can be simultaneously true because they were never meant to be true. They were meant to confuse. And Kurt Collins, the researcher who spent more time in the primary documents of this case than anyone alive, puts it this way. He says the involvement of biased ufologists and rumors spread by people like Doty and more hopelessly contaminated the investigation. It left it indistinguishable from a hoax. The witnesses were reduced to supporting characters in their own story. Doty exploited them. Moore enabled it. And the lawsuit, the one legal shot Betty and Vickie had at accountability, that may have been doomed the moment their attorney started chasing a fictional project invented by the Air Force counterintelligence. Betty Cash spent 18 years fighting. The government wouldn't help her, the UFO community used her, and the clock was running out. After the lawsuit's dismissed in '86, Betty Cash doesn't quit. If anything, she gets louder. She starts doing radio interviews, TV appearances, she attends UFO conferences, she writes letters to senators, congressmen, anyone who'll listen. She appears on a paranormal talk show in Montgomery, Alabama called In Touch, becomes a regular guest. She goes to Gulf Breeze, Florida during a UFO flap down there. She speaks at conventions and networks with anyone she thinks can help her case. She even gets a new attorney, Clay Ford out of Gulf Breeze, a retired colonel who once specialized in war planning for the U.S. Army in Europe. Ford says he wants to reopen the case by showing government officials lied about their record-keeping procedures during pretrial proceedings. He's also, by the way, negotiating the sale of his client's movie rights. Sadly, the Cash-Landrum movie never gets made. But Betty doesn't stop. In 1988, she appears on that UFO cover-up live special we talked about, the one where Doty plays Falcon in the shadows. Betty sits in front of the camera and says, "I'm mad. I'm mad as hell and disappointed with the government of our United States." The show runs a phone poll asking whether Congress should hold hearings on UFOs. Betty takes that personally. She starts petitioning for congressional hearings, circulating a petition with MUFON's help. None of it goes anywhere. In 1991, more than 10 years after the encounter, the case gets its biggest audience. NBC's Unsolved Mysteries airs a segment called Texas UFO. It features Betty, Vickie, John Schuessler, Dr. McKelland, and L.L. Walker, plus a dramatic reenactment with actors. Betty's still focused. She's still fighting. She says on camera, if it's a top secret object that's protecting the United States, then I could say I could forgive them for that. But at least they owe us to tell us exactly why we were burned and what type of radiation we were exposed to and how much. The episode generates tips. Anonymous callers claiming to be military, claiming that they flew helicopters that night, linking the UFO to classified programs. Schuessler says the trouble is that most all of these people with something significant to say were anonymous. Sound familiar? The story stays in the public eye through the 90s, mostly through UFO magazines, books, the occasional TV segment. Betty appears on Fox's Encounters, the UFO conspiracy in 1994. She says, "I don't trust our United States government, and I don't mean to be short or ugly, but that's exactly the way I feel. And if they want to do anything about it, let them do it." Meanwhile, her health is in slow motion collapse. The breast cancer, the mastectomy, the reoccurring tumors, bouts of pneumonia, immune system damage that never recovers. She moves back to Alabama in early '81 to be near her mother. She eventually settles near Lake Logan Martin. She's in and out of hospitals for years. The sun coming through the car window is enough to burn her. She says, "I think my immunity system's messed up." Her truck stop diner business days are history. Fatigue is a constant companion, but she won't stop talking. She won't stop fighting. In mid-1998, John Schuessler publishes his book, The Cash-Landrum UFO Incident. That same year, A&E's The Unexplained airs an episode called Close Encounters. It features an extended segment on the case. Betty's interviewed. It's her last time on camera. "They ruined my health. They ruined my life. So what else is there that they can do other than kill me? And they probably would love to do that, but I'm so stubborn and hard-headed that I'm going to show them. In November 1998, Betty Cash is hospitalized with a stroke. She dies on December 29th, 1998, the 18th anniversary of the encounter. She's 69 years old. Her obituary in the local paper says she was a native of Birmingham. She lived in Oxford, Alabama for the past 6 years. It doesn't mention UFO or radiation. Nothing about 18 years that she spent trying to get the government to tell her the truth. Her gravestone reads, "Beloved Mother Betty Cash, December 19th, 1929, December 29th, 1998. Vickie Landrum dies September 27th, 2007 at the age of 83. She never got answers either. Colby Landrum is the last witness. He appeared on TV over the years to tell his story and faced ridicule from people who say it never happened. He was 7 years old in the back seat of the car. He counted 23 helicopters, and he's still telling anybody who'll listen. So what do we actually know? We know that something happened on FM 1485 on the night of December 29th, 1980. 3 people were injured, and the medical evidence is documented. We know multiple independent witnesses saw unusual aerial activity in the same area on the same night, and this included a veteran police officer who identified the military helicopters with Army insignias. The U.S. Army investigated whether its own helicopters were involved and concluded they weren't, while simultaneously finding the witnesses credible. We know that the lawsuit was dismissed on procedural grounds, not because the government proved nothing happened. It was because the witnesses couldn't identify which specific agency was responsible. The investigation was contaminated by disinformation agents who manufactured fictional explanations. They fed them to the witnesses, the attorney, and they may have contributed to the legal case's failure. And Betty Cash died on the anniversary of the worst night of her life, and she's still waiting for someone to tell her what burned her. What we don't know is what the object was. We don't know where 23 helicopters came from if every military branch says that they weren't flying that night. We don't know why the road where the encounter happened was repaved, dug up with unmarked trucks. We don't know why, after 45 years, nobody in the United States government has ever offered these people a straight answer. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.